Hello, children. This is Grandma Carla with Chapter 10 of Freddy Goes Camping. And this is a great book by Walter R. Brooks, who has an amazing imagination. Chapter 10. At the first pale glimmer of dawn, Freddy crawled out of his sleeping bag. Mr. Camphor in the other bag and Bannister rolled up in a blanket seemed to be having a snoring competition. Freddy listened a minute and awarded the prize to Bannister. His snores weren't as loud, but they had more variety. Then he went down and washed in the lake. The light was growing, and the eastern sky began to glow red, as if some giant had opened a furnace door behind the hills. Freddy sat down and watched it and sniffed the fresh morning smells of water and pine and spruce and damp earth, and he thought, my goodness, I didn't know camping was so nice. But am I hungry? Don't suppose we ought to start the fire until they get up, though. Maybe I won't be so hungry if I made up a poem. So he started one. It went to the tune of Mandalay, and he sang it. By the old hotel at Lakeside, looking southward across the sea, there's a bright campfire burning, and I know it burns for me. For the wind is in the pine trees, and the murmuring needles say, come you back, you pig detective, come you back to Jones's Bay, come you back to Jones's Bay. Then he went on to the chorus a little louder, and gradually, as sometimes happens to poets, his hunger for breakfast got mixed up in the poem, so that the chorus went on like this. Oh, the road to Jones's Bay, where the flying flapjacks play, you can hear the bacon sizzling from your bed at break of day. On the road to Jones's Bay, we will sing and shout hooray, and when your breakfast's ready, they'll bring it on a tray. Well, well, he said, I guess I'd better do something to take my mind off my stomach. There was a cold flapjack left over from last night, lying on a plate beside the fireplace. He picked it up and took a bite out of it, but even the sharpest appetite will blunt itself on a cold flapjack. He started to throw it into the lake and then put it in the frying pan and practice flipping it. He thought he would practice until he could make it turn 3 complete somersaults without missing the pan when it came down, and would then astonish Mr. Camphor with his skill. But after 10 minutes, he had dropped the flapjack so many times that it was about worn out, and the snoring competition in the lean-to was still going on. He thought, my gracious, I'm neglecting my detective duties. They won't wake up for another hour. I'd better go up and snoop around the hotel. And so he did. It wasn't very good snooping. The office and the lounge offered no clues. It wasn't until he started down the dock that he found the handkerchief. An ordinary white handkerchief with "Aha" marked on one corner in indelible ink. So Aha is really his name, he thought. But what does that get me? I still don't know where he lives. And he was thinking this over when a little squeaky voice said somewhere, help! Freddy looked all around but couldn't see anybody. Where are you? He called. In the boathouse. There were a number of canoes and rowboats on racks in the boathouse. Back of them, and hung from a hook in the ceiling, was a big rat trap, a square wire cage with a spring door, and in it was a rat. Now, rats look a good deal alike, and so for that matter, so do squirrels and pigs and elephants. But when you get to know them, you find that they differ in looks as much as people do. Freddy had known Simon and his family pretty well, and he recognized this rat at once as Simon's son, Ezra, the one that Mr. Aha was holding as hostage for his family's good behavior. As soon as he saw Freddy, Ezra sat up and put his 4 paws against the wire and began begging to be let out. Now, wait a minute, said Freddy, realizing that the rat had not recognized him. If Mrs. Fillmore caught you in this trap, I can't let you out without her permission. Mrs. Fillmore didn't have anything to do with it, Ezra squeaked. Who are you anyway? I never saw you before. Well, I know who you are, said Freddy. If I'm not mistaken, you are closely related to a rat that lived in my barn all one winter. Old Simon. Fine, sturdy old fellow, Simon. We got to be great pals. You look enough like him to be his son. I am his son, and if you let me out, I tell you he's offering a big reward for me, and you'll get it all, he said eagerly. Look, you tell me where you live, and he'll bring it to you tomorrow. Said Freddy. You're a better liar than I am, Ezra. He took off his cap. Know me now? Oh, gosh, said Ezra. Freddy! Oh, gee, I'm sunk now, all right. And he lay down on the floor of the cage. Maybe so, said the pig. And he picked up the trap and started down the trail to the camp. If you tell me what we want to know, maybe I'll let you go. The two men were up and getting breakfast. They didn't think much of Freddy's capture. He's just one of the gang, said Mr. Camphor. Now, if you'd captured them all, sit down and have some coffee. He's Simon's son, said Freddy. My guess is that in the hurry of getting away last night, they forgot all about him down at the boathouse. But Mr. Aha doesn't want to lose him because Ezra is the only hold that he has over Simon, and he needs Simon's help for his scheme. I bet you anything he comes back for Ezra tonight. And then what do we do, said Mr. Camphor. Chase him around in the woods and make faces at each other again? The trouble is, Freddy said, that we don't know who Aha is. Maybe Simon knows, but I don't believe that the other rats do. I don't think Ezra knows anything. Hey, Ez? He said, glancing at the cage. The rat made a face at him. But I'm pretty sure he lives in Cinderborough, Freddy went on, because look at these. And he drew out the slips of paper that he had found in Aha's coat. They were checks for meals that someone had eaten at Dixon's diner. He must eat at the diner often, Freddy said, because he wouldn't be able to sneak every check he got into his pocket and walk out without paying, which is what he must have done. For how else could he have got them? You know what? I'm going down to Cinderborough and try to find him this afternoon. Well, even if you did find out who he was, said Mr. Camphor, the police wouldn't believe any such story. Rats and ghosts. They'd just give you the old heave-ho. Sure, we won't bother the police. We'll just bother Mr. Aha. You leave it to the old reliable firm. They know how to handle crooks. Hey, he said suddenly, what goes on? And he pointed across the lake. Far across, where the lawns of the Camphor estate made a pale green line on the distant shore, something white fluttered. Someone's waving a tablecloth, said Bannister. Must be something wrong, said Mr. Camphor, getting up. Better go see. Freddy sat in the middle of the canoe with the rat trap on his knees, and under the strong strokes of Mr. Camphor and the butler, the canoe cut sharply through the blue and silver ripples. As they came closer, the lawns widened out, and the house and the dock and the trees grew larger, and a group at the edge of the water grew more distinct. Ha! Freddy exclaimed. Reinforcements! And there indeed were nearly all of the animals from the bean farm. Mrs. Wiggins and one of her sisters, Mrs. Wogus, Henrietta and Charles, Robert and Georgie, the dogs, Jinx, and even the 4 mice, Eek and Quick and Eenie and Cousin Augustus. And my gracious, said Freddy, there's Mr. Bean too. It was indeed Mr. Bean, who stepped forward and held the canoe for them as they climbed out. Very pleased to see you, sir, said Mr. Camphor, shaking hands with him. I take it you've heard about the plans this villain, Aha, has for getting hold of our properties, and have brought these animals up to defeat him. 'Tain't my doing, said Mr. Bean. Mrs. Bean, she heard about it somewheres. He frowned slightly. He was kind of old-fashioned about having animals talk. It made him uneasy, and he always said animals should be seen and not heard. So Freddy and his friends seldom said anything to him. If there was anything important, they told Mrs. Bean. He never asked her where such information came from, but of course he knew, and he was pretty proud secretly of having such clever animals. Mr. Bean went on. Mrs. Bean says, Mr. B, says she, don't you let those animals go up to Camphor's alone. Well, Mrs. B, says I figure our Freddy is running this show, and I don't ever interfere with him. If he wants my help, he knows he can ask for it and get it. But according to what I hear, she says, this rapscallion, is going to try to get our place next. And I'll be ready for him, I says. But, says I, if Miss Camphor and this hotel woman's in trouble, maybe it's only neighborly for me to traipse along. If they don't want me, they can tell me so. And we're very grateful, said Mr. Camphor, seizing Mr. Bean's hand and shaking it again. Come up on the terrace and we'll talk it over. Bannister, the 25-cent cigars. The animals had stood quietly listening. They were bursting with questions for Freddy, but they knew their talk would disturb Mr. Bean, and they respected his wishes, for they were very fond of him. As the men turned away, they gathered around the pig, but before they could say anything, a shrill voice called to them, Jimson Camphor, what are all those animals doing here? And they saw Miss Minerva's ant figure striding angrily down towards them. Oh, just some friends of mine, said Mr. Camphor. Aunt Minerva, may I present Mr. William Bean? How do, she said shortly. Are you the manager of this menagerie? These are private grounds. You can't bring these animals in here. Come, Aunt, said Mr. Camphor. After all, they're my grounds. And Mr. Bean laid a hand on his arm and winked one eye. Then he turned to Miss Minerva and said with a courtly bow, My dear lady, I assure you that we are only here to serve you, to protect you from the villain who is plotting to defraud your nephew of his fine property. What villain? Said Miss Minerva. I know nothing of any plot. Well, there is one, put in Mr. Camphor, and he told her about Mr. Aha and his schemes. Folderol, said she exclaimed. I never heard such nonsense. You men are all the same, scared of your own shadows, and seeing bogies behind every bush. Where is this Aha? Let me talk to him. That's just the trouble, ma'am, said Mr. Bean. We don't know who he is, or where, or when he may strike. However, you have requested me to leave, and a bean, ma'am, could never refuse the request of so charming a lady. Come, animals. The animals, of course, couldn't move. They stared at Mr. Bean, and their eyes almost fell out of their sockets, for this was a Mr. Bean that they did not know. These polished manners, these lavish compliments, they could hardly believe their ears. Miss Minerva's face relaxed into what might have been the beginning of a smile, and she looked sidelong at Mr. Bean. Well, she said slowly, if you put it that way. I do put it that way, ma'am, he replied firmly. That is exactly how I put it. A charming and cultured lady like yourself. Whom am I to refuse your lightest request? Miss Minerva really smiled now. Flatterer, she said, and squeaked faintly with pleasure, and she continued to look curiously at him. But nobody ever found out anything about Mr. Bean by looking at him. Behind those whiskers, he might have been handsome or plain. He might be smiling or scornful. Nobody ever knew, not even Mrs. Bean. Come, animals, he again said. Wait, said Miss Minerva. Perhaps I've been too hasty. Come, she said, putting her hand through his arm. Let us go up on the terrace, and you can tell me more of this plot. Well, great day in the morning, said Mr. Camphor, staring after them. Mrs. Wiggins laughed her comfortable laugh. I told you you'd get along better with her if you'd pay her a compliment once in a while, she said. Mr. Camphor closed his eyes a moment in intense thought. Then he opened them and said to the butler, Music hath charms to soothe the savage beast. I think that proverb about covers it, eh, Bannister? No doubt, sir, if you can honestly classify that voice as music. And on the other hand, there's this one, fine words butter no parsnips. Ha, said Mr. Camphor, Aunt Minerva's no parsnip, but I'd say he buttered her up all right. The animals had surrounded Freddy and were talking and laughing and congratulating him on his capture of Ezra. Hooray for Freddy, they shouted. He brings them back alive. Freddy always gets his animal. Jinx pushed through the cloud. He put a paw on the trap and peered in at the rat, who squeezed back into a corner. What you got in this bird cage, Freddy? Pretty little thing, ain't he? Can he sing? Like a thrush, Jinx, like a thrush, said Freddy. Want to hear him? Give us a song, Ez. Ah, you think you're awful funny, Ezra snarled. You just wait till Mr. Aha gets here, you big stuck-up. Ouch, he squeaked. You quit that, for Jinx had reached through the wires and cuffed his ear. You had not to do that, Jinx, said Mrs. Wiggins. Well then, let him quit calling names, the grimy sneak, said Jinx. The rat sneered at him. Who's calling names now? If I wasn't in a cage, you wouldn't talk so big. Oh, shut up, both of you, said Freddy. Now look, animals, Mr. Aha is going to make plenty of trouble for all of us if we don't stop him. Once we know who he is, we can pepper his hash, all right? So I'm going down to Cinderboro and find out. Georgie, I need your help. Will you go with me? Gee, you bet I will, said the little brown dog. All right, we'll see if Bannister will drive us down to save time. The rest of you, my goodness, I'm glad you came up today. You're going to be needed. Until I get back, the main thing is to see that Ezra does not get away. And keep an eye out for Simon and the rest of the gang. I have a hunch they're around here somewhere, and they might try a rescue. And that was a fun chapter. Let's look at the pictures. Here is Freddy waking up at the campground, and he's very hungry, remember? And so he made a poem. And here is a picture of Freddy finding Ezra, Simon's son, in a trap box. And Mr. Little Ezra wants to get out. Ezra put his forepaws against the wire, began begging to be let out. And here is a picture of how we're starting chapter 11 next. There is Freddy going to town to see what he can find out about Mr. Aha. This is Grandma Carla, and I love you.